Elsässer, Sie befassen sich als Sterbeforscherin schon seit...
Miss Elsässer, you have been dealing with after-death contacts as a thanatologist for a long time and have also participated in related studies. Today I would like to talk to you about a special aspect of after-death contacts, namely that there are also very few cases of frightening after-death contacts. To get into the topic, I would like to ask you to give a few examples of what frightening, fear-inducing experiences are made in the context of after-death contacts.
With pleasure. First of all, I would like to say that these are only very few cases. We conducted our first study in French, English, and Spanish with 1,004 participants. And then we conducted the same survey in German with an additional 235 cases. At the moment, the study is running in Chinese. So you see, we have a very large data set. And of these many participants in the German survey, only 10% were frightened by their after-death contact. And in the first survey, it was only 12%. So it's a small percentage. But if you know how many people experience after-death contacts, this is still a very large number of people who were frightened.
Many people, yes.
We know that 50 to 60% of people experience one or more after-death contacts spontaneously throughout their lives.
Meaning they spontaneously have the feeling of a presence.
Exactly. Or see or hear or feel the deceased, feel their presence. It is a very common phenomenon, as we know. And of this large number of participants in the German survey, it was 10%. Now, I can read you a short report if you like.
As an example.
As an example. This was a 14-year-old young woman at the time of the contact. She perceived the sister of her then boyfriend. This young woman was pregnant and unfortunately died in a car accident, and she already had a little son, so it was a very dramatic situation. A young woman who died, and our participant then experienced various contacts with this deceased woman. Here's a short report that she wrote to us in our questionnaire. When we had to say goodbye to her at the open grave at the cemetery, I saw her body in the coffin and her spirit standing next to the coffin. This experience shook her very much, and later she had several more contacts with this young woman. I also saw her at the funeral. She had left behind a son. He grew up with my then boyfriend and his parents. I often noticed her presence in the house. Sometimes when I picked the little one up out of bed, I had the impression that she was standing in the room. Out of a terrible fear, I often quickly ran down to the others to distract myself from it. This experience preoccupied me for a very long time.
So the way of perceiving is actually always similar, but how it is interpreted, in this case fearfully, is different.
Exactly.
Can this be brought to a point? What kind of fears occur?
I would say that one of the fears is the impression of experiencing something that is not possible. This is of course related to our materialistic attitude to reality, which we still have in our Western societies. People are convinced that the contact was real. We have the numbers for this. We have examined this. In the very, very large majority, they say this contact was real. And yet, it is impossible for people who have a materialistic view of reality.
When you say real, it means that they can distinguish it from how, for example, a dream usually feels, and they say that was something else. Or they know they did not just imagine it. This is something else, it's not some other mental image.
They are very sure, exactly. They are very sure because it happens completely unexpectedly. They did nothing to make it happen. They often would not have thought it possible to have contact with a deceased person. They say that the contact was initiated by the deceased. I did nothing to make it happen. It happened out of nowhere without me doing anything to make it happen. And they are also sure that if it happened when they were asleep, which sometimes happens, they say it was not a dream. I know what dreams are. It was not a dream, it was real. I remember it today after 20 or 30 years with so much detail, which is not always the case with dreams. They say, no, it was real, I am sure. I was really contacted by my deceased relative.
This means that the fears always arise from the fact that you are experiencing something that is actually impossible. It should not be, the great unknown. Is that the fear?
Exactly. I think that is a big part of the fear, and also the fear of having to share it with others. For example, this young woman I mentioned said I was afraid that the deceased would tell me something that I should tell her family, and that would have absolutely overwhelmed me, because then I would have had to tell them that I was perceiving her. Maybe they would not have believed me. In addition, there is also the fear of losing your mind. You hear that very often. I know I've experienced it, but maybe I have a psychological problem, because I've never heard of people perceiving the deceased. This is also a problem. People do not talk about it. It is a very common phenomenon. But people keep it to themselves and then think that it only happened to them. I am the only person in the world who has experienced this. How can I share this with others? This is also part of the fear of losing your mind. What is also important, what one might add, this young girl did not know the deceased very well. It was the sister of her boyfriend, but they were not close. There was no relationship of love, of affection or friendship between these two people. And when you perceive a deceased person who you do not know well, it is not always as beautiful an experience as for people who perceive a beloved deceased person and immediately feel this love, this affection. You know the deceased person manifested itself to me to calm me down, to comfort me, to tell me I am still alive, I'm still by your side, you're not alone. In the cases where one perceives a deceased person who one does not know well, these emotions are not there. Sometimes this can be a little scary. In our study, we also have different cases of people who perceived unknown deceased people. Depending on the language, it was between 4 and 12%. And all these participants said it was not a beautiful experience. It troubled me, it scared me. I did not know why I was chosen for this contact. Maybe I should do something for the deceased person, but what can I do? Does he need help? These are not so pleasant experiences.
Is there a case where, for example, a specific message is conveyed, and a contacted person is afraid that his own life plan or something else will be shaken, and fears arise from this?
No, while most have received a message, these messages are always very comforting, always very supportive. The most important, the most frequent message is, I have survived the death of my body. I still exist. I am there, I am by your side. I will help you in this difficult time of grief. You are not alone.
And also in the sense of, I'm fine.
Exactly. I live and I am fine. This is probably the most frequent message we have read in our experience reports. You don't have to worry. Stop mourning. Stop crying. I'm fine. We hear that very often. And what is interesting, in all these cases that I have read, I have not found a single case where the message was somehow threatening or aggressive, or something that could cause you fear. It was always comforting. It was always full of love, full of affection. It is not the content of the context that can cause fear. It is really the fact of experiencing a contact with a deceased person, and above all, for the people who thought it was impossible before they experienced it.
You have already mentioned at the beginning that all that you are now telling us is the result of a project, a study. Maybe you can briefly describe how it came about, how the whole survey took place, and what the summary is for you personally.
With pleasure. We received research funds from a foundation in 2018 and then started this multilingual long-term research project. I work with my colleagues from the University of Northampton in England, Professor Chris Rowe, Associate Professor Callum Cooper, our research assistant is Sophie Morrison, and then there is David Lorimer from the Scientific Medical Network and me, so there are 5 of us. And as I have already mentioned, we did a first study in English, French and Spanish. We developed a very, very detailed questionnaire with 194 questions.
Did you easily find people who wanted to participate?
We were a little worried that we were demanding too much from our participants. It took about 2 hours to fill out the questionnaire. That was a little worrying to us, but apparently it wasn't a problem. For the first survey, we had 104 participants, and for the second survey in German, 235 additional people who filled out the questionnaire. And what we see in their answers is that this experience is very, very important for people. It is an incisive experience in their lives. They talk little about it or not at all. And they were really happy that in connection with this study, they were being listened to in a secure environment where no one would make fun of them. On the contrary, we really felt this joy that they had the possibility to talk about this wonderful experience.
To be allowed to answer 200 questions.
Exactly.
Could one summarize it like this? The majority of after-death contacts are experienced as blissful and comforting.
That is precisely the conclusion.
But after-death contacts are not always experienced in this way. And the reason for this is not the content of the messages, but that this experience doesn't fit into the personal worldview of the affected person.
Not to the personal worldview, but also not to the worldview that we are taught at school. We are all raised with this materialistic attitude, with this idea that consciousness happens in the brain as long as we live, but that when we die, consciousness disappears. And with this attitude, it is not possible to perceive the deceased. And then there is this dilemma for people. I have experienced it, it was real, but it is impossible. This is a big problem. And now, as you know, there's this great tendency toward the post-materialistic hypothesis, which is being actively researched and debated at the moment. And with this vision of reality, consciousness is fundamental, not local, and universal.
If we all are raised with a materialistic worldview, why are only 10% of people afraid? Could one not then conclude that perhaps this materialistic worldview has not taken root in people's hearts?
I think this is a very, very good comment. I totally agree with you. This is definitely the case, and the positive emotions. It was so beautiful, they felt the love, they felt the comfort, and this is then more important and stronger than the attitude they had before the experience, that this is not possible at all. This is then something so important in their lives that the attitude they had before is no longer important.
You talked about post-materialism. I myself am not quite sure whether there is a development worthy of the term, but if we assume that consciousness did not develop as a consequence of matter, that it doesn't stem from brain functions as it is generally considered, what could be an alternative theory from your point of view? A conclusive, convincing alternative theory?
There are currently many studies on this topic, and there are very talented people such as Bernardo Kastrup, who works and researches in this field. Not just him, many others too. The idea is that everything is mental. Even the universe is mental. Consciousness is the foundation of everything, of us, of our environment, all the way up to the universe. While the materialistic hypothesis, which is just a hypothesis, says that everything comes from matter and ends with matter, and all phenomena can be explained through the materialistic view, and those that cannot be explained do not exist. This is what you hear again and again. After-death contacts are misperceptions. People are depressed, they are in mourning, they just imagined it. You hear that very often. But it's not like that. We see this in the numbers and the data that we have collected. A quarter of our participants were no longer in mourning. So it's not always the mourners who can have these experiences. If that were the reason, it certainly is not the reason in all cases, and perhaps in none of the cases. Maybe it actually happens to be that the deceased can contact the living. And for me personally, I was already very convinced by the after-death contacts that I have been researching for many years now, and then also experienced myself a few years ago. I don't really need research results to confirm my opinion. It's already done. But that's not important. My attitude isn't important. What is important is what research shows us every day, so that this post-materialistic attitude can be strengthened and transmitted to people, especially in the case where people have a near-death experience an after-death contact, so that they can better understand what happened, so that they no longer have the fear of losing their mind, of not being believed, and yes, that they may even be ridiculed. It's a shame.
So, for you personally, all these experiences are not just a sign that we humans have a spiritual component within us, but also a strong indication that life isn't limited to the material body, and that it continues after death. Can I put it that way?
You have put it very well. It's conviction that has arisen over all these many years that I have done research, first about near-death experiences and now about after-death contacts. It is really because I've listened to so many people and have read so many experience reports in our study that I am now really convinced that the deceased can communicate with the living.
That means that your research journey, first on near-death experiences and now on after-death contacts, has changed you very much personally.
Yes.
Did you have a materialistic worldview before?
I wasn't sure. Even the first few years when I was involved with near-death experiences, I wasn't quite sure yet whether it really played out that way. And it took about 40 years until I am now really 100% convinced of it.
Was there a special trigger that led you to research near-death experiences in the first place? Or was it an ideological interest of yours?
It was an ideological interest, but I think the reason was also that I was very afraid of death. Even as a teenager, I wasn't really afraid that I would die or that someone I love would die, but this idea of death always worried me a lot. I think that was the reason why I started to embark on this journey, as you said.
What about nowadays? Do you still fear death?
I have no more fear.
Thank you for the interview.
Thank you very much.